The massive Connecticut State Armory and Arsenal, located near the State Capitol building, has been a prominent Hartford landmark since it opened in 1909. But did you know there was an earlier armory, just a few blocks away, that was in service for about 30 years and had started life as a skating rink? Hi, this is History with me, Dan Sterner. Please hit the subscribe button as we explore Hartford's lost armory on Elm Street. The large Renaissance Revival-style building that now stands at 55 Elm Street in Hartford, across from Pulaski Circle, was erected in 1926 for the Connecticut General Life Insurance Company. Back in 1877, when this bird's-eye view was made, the vicinity looked quite different. For one thing, the Park River, which today flows through a conduit under Pulaski Circle, was above ground. The river made a curve here as it bent to flow around the eastern end of Bushnell Park. Hudson Street had not yet been extended this far north, so there were still old buildings standing where Hudson intersects with Elm Street today. At what's now the corner of Hudson and Elm was a large building erected in 1869 as a skating rink. It was used for ice skating during the winter and roller skating in warmer weather. Built for a skating rink association that included such prominent citizens as former Governor Joseph R. Hawley and silk manufacturer Frank W. Cheney, it was constructed by J. H. Johnson & Company, a firm that had erected similar rinks in other American cities. The Hartford rink was 200 feet in length and about 80 feet in width. Part of this space included the entrance and office with dressing rooms and cloakrooms, and a restaurant above that had glass doors providing a view of the skaters. The skating surface was able to accommodate 500 to 600 skaters at a time. At other times, events could be held for over 2,000 people. The facility's grand opening on Friday, October 1st, 1869, was advertised as an immense attraction. It featured a grand orchestral concert by Gilmore's full band, featuring the cornet player Matthew Arbuckle. Patrick S. Gilmore was an Irish-born military band leader who had written the lyrics to When Johnny Comes Marching Home while he was serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. Just a few months before performing in Hartford, Gilmore had organized and led the massive music festival in Boston called the National Peace Jubilee, which commemorated the end of the Civil War. Cornet soloist Arbuckle also performed at the Jubilee. An article in the Hartford Current newspaper on May 22, 1908, looked back on the early days of the skating rink. Quote, "The idea was to flood the place in the winter and let it freeze by sheer force of the elements. A number of prominent businessmen were in the project, which ended in a dismal failure, partly because the first winter was a mild one, and the great tank, which was built in the main part of the building, persistently refused to freeze over, so that while there was a little ice skating now and then, the result was in the main a fiasco. A resident of that time, however, remembers one notable incident of this brief-lived project. With the idea of drawing a big crowd, it was announced one day that a pig would be put on the ice and would give an exhibition of skating. The crowd came as crowds do, the pig was produced, skates were strapped on his 4 feet, and he was shoved out onto the ice. But instead of cutting figures 8 and grapevines, Mr. Hogg promptly lay down on the ice and put himself in line for a primitive kind of cold storage. The trainers came out and put him on his feet, but down he went again, and all efforts to have him strike out bravely were in vain. But, as the narrator says, the crowd had enough delight in the struggles of the men to repay them and more for the inactivity of the porcine." Unquote. As I mentioned, the rink could accommodate large crowds. At the start of 1878, it was rented out for a month for some of the great Christian revival meetings that Dwight L. Moody and Ira A. Sankey were holding at the time in cities throughout the country, like this one at a rink in Brooklyn, New York. Thousands in Hartford attended to hear Moody's preaching and Sankey's singing. As the 1908 Current article recalled, looking back 30 years later, quote, "It being in the winter, and the tank being naturally a chilly place, steam pipes were run along under the rows of chairs to cheer the revivalists. The easiest thing to do in such cases was to rest one's feet on the steam pipes, with the result that burned shoes were a common malady in Hartford that winter." Unquote. As for the facility's transition into a military armory, quote, "After a short existence as a skating rink, and by the way, to its last day the place will never lose its first name of the rink among old residents. The place had a short career as a storehouse for wool in the ownership of Judd and Root. From this use it was rescued by General, then Colonel, Lucius A. Barber, who was a member of the firm of Judd and Root, and it was rented by him to the state for an armory in 1877, from which time dates its military history." Unquote. Barber, who later served as Connecticut Adjutant General, was then in command of Connecticut's First Regiment of the National Guard. The regiment's various companies had previously leased accommodations in different halls around the city, but Barber undertook a thorough reorganization of the regiment, securing the former skating rink as its regimental quarters. In 1879, George Keller, architect of the Soldiers' and Sailors' Arch in Hartford, was hired to design a new front section or head house for the armory. Its high Victorian Gothic-style architecture closely resembled his earlier design for the 1873 Elm Street jail. The new armory front was described in the American Architect and Building News. Quote, "The main building on the front is 3 stories in height, with an ample entrance midway in the front, which is 80 feet wide. A central tower is carried up about 70 feet. The building is of brick laid in red mortar with a finish in Ohio stone, relieved by bands of diaper brick, molded brick being largely used for jambs and arches of windows, and black brick is introduced in ornamental courses." Unquote. Although the building was now dedicated to a military function, the state initially was only leasing it, and so the First Regiment had to pay all the running expenses such as lighting and heating. That's why the regiment, to raise money, continued to lease the building for non-military purposes, even though this sometimes interfered with its regular drill nights. There was roller skating, political gatherings, and other public events, including horse shows and even bicycle exhibitions. James G. Blaine spoke at the Armory when he was a candidate for the presidency in 1884. When the state formally purchased the building in 1887, the regiment's officers anticipated having free use of their drill hall again, but in 1888, the state quartermaster general allowed the armory to be rented out for professional polo matches 3 nights a week. There was a craze for polo at the time, and the matches were organized by the Hartford Amusement Association, which also owned Hartford's baseball club and was led by Governor Morgan G. Bulkley. As the Current recalled in 1908, quote, "Under this regime, the character of the place began to descend rapidly. Tiers of seats blocked the floor, the game itself was wrecking the building, and the crowds which attended the games left their traces for days afterwards. At this, the officers of the regiment began a fight to have the polo discontinued, and to make a long story short, the whole affair ended in the dishonorable discharge by the governor of not only the field and staff, but line officers of the regiment. Later, the dishonorable discharge was changed to honorable, but the officers were not reinstated, and it was years before the regiment recovered its former strength." Unquote. The objecting officers, led by Colonel William E. Cone, were discharged by Governor Bulkley in 1890. Cone was part of a prominent Hartford family that had a hardware store on Asylum Street. Many years later, the Cone Annex to the Brown School would be named in his honor. 6 years after the officers were discharged on January 22, 1896, the Current reported that the great anti-polo fight of 1888 to 1890 had at last borne fruit when, after a meeting of the governor and senior officers, it was decided, quote, "The state armories are hereafter to be used exclusively for military purposes for which they were intended, not for revival services, polo, roller skating, bicycle rinks, political conventions, and other gatherings for which they have always been in great demand," unquote. With the consent of the officers, the armory could still be used for other purposes. For instance, there was a bicycle riding school conducted there in the 1890s by the Pope Manufacturing Company, makers of Columbia bicycles. The armory was expanded in the mid-1890s, but the structure had many problems. The drill shed was considered to be too small. There was damage to equipment due to the continually damp conditions owing to the leaky roof, and the building required frequent, expensive repairs. By the start of the 20th century, it was considered a waste of money to make further repairs, and eventually the current state armory was built to replace both the Elm Street Armory and the old state arsenal in the city's north end. Vacated by the military in 1909, the Elm Street Armory was sold to James H. Clarkin, owner of the Hartford Senators baseball team. He operated the former armory as an amusement hall called the Park Casino until he sold the building in 1916 to the Hartford Buick Company, which turned it into a service station. The Connecticut General Life Insurance Company eventually acquired the property and secured a permit to tear down the old armory in 1924. As we know, it soon erected the current building on the site, which took its place along Elm Street's Insurance Row. The old Hartford skating rink, which was transformed into the First Regiment Armory and was later the Park Casino and a Buick service station, stood for over half a century across from Bushnell Park. It served as a military facility for a little over 30 years and was the scene of many notable public events in Hartford over the years. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean a lot to me if you would hit the like and subscribe buttons, leave a comment, and check out the channel's Join tab to learn about memberships. Thanks for watching.